on your screen. This evening, Books and Books is honored to welcome back Dr. Marvin Dunn, presenting his new book, A History of Florida Through Black Eyes. Dr. Dunn taught in the Department of Psychology at Florida International University for 34 years, retiring as chairman of the department in 2006. He earned his PhD in psychology from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. He has co-authored The Miami Riot of 1980, Crossing the Bounds with Bruce Porter, and authored Black Miami in the 20th Century and The Beast in Florida, A History of Anti-Black Violence. He has also directed 3 documentary films, Black Seminoles in the Bahamas, The Red Bays Story, Murder on the Suwannee River, The Willie James Howard Story, and Rosewood Uncovered. The history of blacks in Florida has been deliberately distorted, omitted, and marginalized. Black Floridians have been denied their heroes and heroines, and their stories have mainly been left untold. In this book, Dr. Dunn lifts the veil from some of these stories and places African Americans in the very marrow of Florida history. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Marvin Dunn.
All right, thank you. Good evening. Thank you for coming. I've been asked why I don't write novels. I don't write novels because you can't make up the kind of compelling stories that history presents us in reality. What more tragic figure than Willie James Howard, the 15-year-old boy, Suwannee County, Florida, 1944, who was murdered, actually lynched, for writing a love letter to a white girl. Mind you, Emmett Till was lynched in Money, Mississippi in 1955. This happened in Florida almost a decade, over a decade earlier, and not a whimper. No response outside of Live Oak itself. What more tragic figure than his mother, Lula Howard? Willie James was her only son when he was taken by 3 white men, including the father of this girl that he wrote the letter to. Taken out to the Suwannee River, tied hands and feet, and forced to jump into the river or get shot. And he jumped and he drowned. And his mother didn't really know what happened to him for almost 3 weeks. The father was made to go to this lynching, made to watch it. And then they took him back to work after they killed his son. And he didn't tell his mother, the boy's mother, what happened for 3 weeks. He just said, Willie James isn't coming home. You can't make up a story more powerful than that. Her sister told me, Mamie Perry, her sister told me, she never smiled after that happened, Dr. Dunn. It broke her heart, and I think it killed her. It took years for it to happen. How could you conjure up a more brutal story than what happened to Claude Neal, a man who was made to eat his own genitals before they lynched him? What better hero could be invented than Harry T. Moore? Harry T. Moore, arguably, in my opinion, the bravest man who ever walked in Florida, with the possible exception of Osceola. And most people have no idea who he was or what happened to him on the night of Christmas 1951, when the Klan, we're sure, placed a bomb, and then you're going to have to hold on until we get the technology ahead of me. The Klan placed a bomb underneath the home of the Moores, killed Mr. Moore outright. His wife died a few days later. Why? Why did they kill him? Just go to Moore, please. All right, just until we get the technology. That's where we are, where we should be. The reason they killed, this is important. For a long time, it was thought that Harry T. Moore was killed. Go back. Is it going by itself? Okay, we got to stop this because we need to have let's just hold on for a second because the film is getting ahead of us. Is someone here who could come down and help? Let's just hold on for a second. Want to go ahead? Now let's just hold on. I have a lot of film pictures to show, so let's try to get this straight. Are we ready? Okay. Harry T. Moore was killed because he was registering blacks to vote in rural counties in Florida in the 1930s. Can you imagine getting into his car most Sunday afternoons with his wife and his two daughters and driving through rural counties registering blacks to vote in the 1930s and 1940s? Harry T. Moore knew that sooner or later blacks were going to be allowed to join the Democratic Party in Florida, and that's why he was registering people to vote in the 1940s ahead of this change. And that's why they killed him. It wasn't because he was criticizing Southern sheriffs, Florida sheriffs, for lynchings. It was because he had placed his hands on the lever of political power in the state of Florida. What more disputable, horrible villain could we have than Willis, than the mayor, the sheriff of Lake County? Let's go to the next slide. That's Willis McCall. Willis McCall was sheriff of Lake County. He was our Bull Connor. This photograph was taken of him right after he shot two men who were a part of the so-called Groveland 4 incident, in which 4 black men were accused of raping a white woman, and Willis ended up killing one of these men while he was in his custody. As a matter of fact, Willis also stomped to death a man named Tommy Vickers from Miami. Willis was a very, very typical Southern sheriff at the time. I just want to read for a moment what he said about blacks, give us an idea of the kind of mentality that a lot of people had at the time. And the story about what happened with Tommy Vickers is important. Tommy Vickers was probably mentally retarded at his third. And he was arrested in Miami and taken to Lake County to Willis's jail. And Willis stomped him to death and was tried for murder for it. And when he was on the stand, here's what Sheriff McCall said happened with Tommy Vickers the night that he stomped him to death. I popped him twice with my open hand. So supposedly Vickers was causing a disturbance in the jail, so Willis had to take care of that. I popped him twice with my open hand on the nape of the neck. He looked up at me and shook his head. At this point, he went over and sat down as calm as can be. This is when I said, quote, "That damn nigger ain't as crazy as he would have you believe." McCall was charged with murder in the Vickers case. Few blacks in Lake County were surprised by the not guilty verdict. When giving his assessment of blacks, McCall wrote, "Just as long as you got a little bunch of them together, you're going to have a little bolita, a little moonshine, and a whole lot of sex. Anybody that don't understand that, don't understand them, and that's all there is to it." McCall once explained his views on race by offering this analogy. "Well, I've got a jackass right out there in my pasture, beside one of the finest horses you'll ever see, and I don't mistreat the jackass because he's a jackass." McCall's affection for the jackass may well have been genuine, but then a jackass is a jackass and not a thoroughbred horse. The inherent racism in his analogy is apparent. Blacks are not equal to whites, although it is possible for whites to actually care about blacks. Willis McCall was defeated eventually when Orange County and Lake County, the area around there, started to change in terms of white population. But he was one of Florida's last and most blustery sheriffs of that era. People accused him of being involved in a number of lynchings, not just the killing of Tommy Vickers and others that were under his control at the time. You can't make up a story with a villain more frightening than Willis McCall. Nor can you come up with a love story more compelling than what happened with Anna Jai and her husband, Zephaniah Kingsley. Anna Jai was an African princess. She was stolen and taken to Cuba. Zephaniah Kingsley was a Scotsman who had money, came down to Florida, set up a plantation on St. George Island north of Jacksonville. That's the main house for his plantation. He goes to Havana and he buys this girl. She was a Wolof girl. He takes her to Jacksonville, takes her to his plantation. By the time they land, she's pregnant with his first child. She was 13 years old. She had several children for Zephaniah Kingsley. He married her and considered her his wife. Their children had dinner each night at the table in the big house. When he died, he left his fortune to her. When he was alive and went back to Africa to get more slaves, he left her in charge of his plantation. They had a true love relationship. He was so disgusted with the way race relations were in Florida that he moved his family and most of his slaves to Haiti to get away from Florida, where he died. And when he died, his will was read, and turns out he left his fortune to his black wife and their children. His white relatives fought that in court, challenged whether or not this black woman, former slave, and these half-white children should be allowed to own these. He had more than one plantation. Guess what the Florida Supreme Court did in this case? They gave the land to Anna and the children. Because in Florida, your property rights and your right to deal with your property the way you choose to was given priority over anything else. So she died a fairly well-off woman. But there are other love stories in Florida history between white men and black women. There were other plantation owners who married black women and treated them as if they were their wives. In the case of Anna Jai, of course, they didn't live in the same house. He had a house for her right behind his house because of proprieties, I guess, the way things had to appear. But I haven't read a novel in 40 years. I have too much to learn about history, too many more stories to tell that actually happened. I was born in Florida in 1940, before the Civil Rights Movement began. That's me on the right, with my brother James. The picture's taken in 1941. My parents were laborers. My dad picked oranges in Central Florida. Eventually, we took to the Migrant Trail, and our family drove from Florida, Central Florida, to Long Island, New York, every summer to work in the potato fields. Let me see, I think. I was about 11 years old when that was taken. But that's what we did. They loaded us all up. We went up to New York and picked potatoes and worked beans and everything else that we could work to make money for the family, and came back to Florida in October. My mom and dad, unlike many migrant parents, never made us stay home and work rather than going to school. When school started, my older brother James and I were old enough to go to school in New York. We had to go to school every day and not sit in the field. And that cost my parents money. I had never been around white people before we went to Long Island. I'd never been around people with names that sounded the way these names sounded. And for the first 2 months, we had to go to school in New York with these white kids. And my brother and I were the only two black kids in the whole school on Long Island. I just wanted to read a passage from that experience. Just 1 second. All my teachers were white. I was made aware very early on that my education in Florida was in no way comparable to that of white students on Long Island. I struggled to make passing grades, yet when we returned to our segregated school in Florida, my brother and I were ahead of students at home. Upon reflection, years later, I realized that even a white child from Florida, where much more money was spent on white education than on black education, would have had difficulty keeping up with New York students. I was coward in the classroom and resorted to trying to disappear for fear of being called upon by the teacher. One day during music class, in order to make me feel included, my teacher, a young woman, asked, "Marvin, why don't you lead us in a song?" "I can't sing," I replied. "Oh, sure you can," she said. "Don't you know some gospel songs? How about Swing Low, Sweet Chariot?" I was embarrassed for a long moment. No one said anything. I felt that I was poor, different, and inept. After way too long a moment, she finally called on another student. Years later, I realized that she had meant well, but she was pandering to a stereotype. Thank goodness she didn't ask me to tap dance. In 1951, we moved to Miami. I was 11 years old. We moved to a segregated housing project in North Dade County. When we moved to Miami, there were more Seminole Indians in downtown Miami than Cubans. You never heard Spanish in 1951. Of course, I attended a segregated public school. When we went to the movies, we rooted for the Cowboys. We didn't know. We went to see Tarzan films, and we didn't understand why the pygmies always had to be wiped out because they were trying to take Jane. It's amazing how you're taught racial stereotypes without even knowing it. And movies certainly provided that. No black heroes in movies, no one to emulate at all in movies at that time. We were brainwashed into thinking that there were no black heroes. I never heard of this guy. That's John Horse. John Horse was a black Seminole, probably the most famous of the black Seminoles. No one told me that there were black Seminoles in Florida fighting American soldiers and killing many of them in order to remain free in Florida. I didn't know that the U.S. government sent soldiers into Florida to round up black people and take them back to Georgia and South Carolina to slavery. I didn't know that when Dade bought it at the Dade Battle in 1935 that there were black men present. The Seminoles wiped Dade out that day. Killed almost all of them. 2 or 3 men survived out of 104 men in the Ocala National Forest. And then the Indians left. And history tells us that 50 black men on saddleless horses rode up. And they saw these men, the remnants of the Dade battle, all bunched together in this little triangular fort they built to try to protect themselves. And these black men climb down and take knives and go from man to man and cut each man's throat. Why would they have done that? I do not appreciate what was going on in Florida history, how it was that people had to fight to be free, how blacks and Seminoles banded together to try to remain free. All of that was kept from us. I didn't know that there were black Union troops in Florida, or that black Union troops even fought in the Civil War. I thought white men freed us. The next slide, please. Let's talk about this guy. We'll talk about the black Union soldiers in a second. That's Black Caesar. He was a pirate in Dade County, what became Dade County, in the 1600s. No one told me about that. Here's a guy who still has on the map today a place named for him, Caesar's Creek. In 1647, he was pirating up and down the east coast of Florida, had a grand old time, took ships at will. He was mean, evil, killed every white man that he ever came in contact with. I knew nothing about this man. As it turned out, the British caught him and executed him along with Blackbeard. Two of them joined together. So I knew about Blackbeard, but I didn't know about this man. What I have found out over time is that black men who were armed and dangerous and resistant were buried in history. You don't hear about those guys. You hear about the much more passive, compliant, non-troublemakers. The only people that I really got any information about when I was a student in Dade County schools and in Volusia County schools was George Washington Carver. They told us about him and the Peanuts, but nothing about Black Caesar, nothing about John Horse, that I would love to have known more about. I saw a movie once about the Seminole Wars in Florida. I was of the impression that some of those were dangerous, violent, vicious people. But that's a part of what we were all subjected to during that time. Let's go to the next slide, please. There were about 1,300 men, black men in Florida, who fought on the Union side. I didn't know that. I didn't know that there were black men at the Battle of Olustee, the most important Civil War battle that took place in Florida. You had the 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry, the most celebrated black fighting force of the time in Florida at Olustee when that battle took place in 1864. Interesting how that all happened. They reenact the Battle of Olustee every year, but there are no black people, as far as I know, involved in the reenactment. But just to tell the story of what happened, Union troops in Jacksonville left their safety in Jacksonville and tried to march to Lake City along the railroad track. And halfway between at Olustee, they got caught by a huge Confederate force that attacked them. Now, Confederates say they won the battle. The Unions say there was a stalemate. But basically, the Union troops took out and ran back towards Jacksonville. The 54th, which was bringing up the rear, rushed forward towards gunfire, threw their blankets, threw their things on the ground, set up a line of fire to protect these white soldiers who were hightailing it back to Jacksonville. And yet, their story didn't make the history books. You wouldn't know that they were at Olustee. Again, the most important Civil War battle that took place in Florida. When Lincoln started arming blacks, there was a lot of resistance to that in the South. They couldn't believe that he was allowing black men to be armed to fight and kill white men. Lincoln would have done anything and did do anything to win that war. Next slide, please. You know, when the war was ending, this is important. When the war was ending, January 1865, General Sherman and Stanton, the Secretary of War, met in Savannah with 20 black preachers that were invited to this meeting. And Stanton and Sherman asked these ministers, when the war is over, what do blacks want most? Free slaves, what would they want most? And almost in unison, they said land. We want land. Give us land and we'll make our way. And that's how the whole 40 acres of the mule thing started. Sherman passed out a few old mules, and some land was given to a few blacks, and then that was killed. That was the end of the blacks getting land. Why did that happen? This is important. When the Civil War ended, the South and the North did not need blacks as landowners, tenant farmers, or individual farmers. They needed the same thing they had before the war happened. Huge plantations, raising and shipping cotton north to textile mills and what have you in the North. So the North and the South had a vested interest in blacks not owning land. So what happened in Savannah in that meeting with Sherman and Stanton and these ministers came to naught. But think about it for a moment. Had the land been distributed in any reasonable way, how things might have been different today. In fact, what happened was the land went back to the white people who owned it before the Civil War started, and blacks today are what was intended that we be at that time, landless laborers for the most part. How did this book get written? Well, I went to a lot of graveyards. I went to Willie James Howard's grave 7 times. 7 times. Every time I went to that boy's grave, he followed me home. This is the cemetery in Newberry, where the victims of the largest mass lynching in Florida history in 1916 took place. It's one of the most beautiful cemeteries I've ever been in, but it holds some of the most tragic stories you can imagine. They lynched 8 people at one time. One of them was a pregnant woman, and most of them are buried in this graveyard in Newberry, 1916, over stolen hogs. The whole thing started over stolen hogs. Let's go to the next slide. So I spent a lot of time in graveyards. This is my wife hates that picture, but this is a graveyard in Rosewood. Had not been visited since 1923 when this happened. It's on private property. And that happens to be the grave of the patriarch of Rosewood, Mr. Goings, the richest man in Rosewood. I started going to Rosewood in 1997. Eventually brought 5 acres of land in Rosewood. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But I spent a lot of time in graveyards, a lot of time in cemeteries. The next one should be Irvin's grave. That's Newberry. When they lynched those people in Newberry, they lynched them at a place called Lynch Hammock, which was used traditionally to lynch black people. And when they lynched Stella Young, the wife of this man who was supposedly leading this gang of hog thieves, she was 8 months pregnant. And when they lynched her, she dropped the baby. The baby survived. Someone else raised the child. Newberry, 1916, the biggest mass lynching in Florida history. The next one. I also visited the graves of people who actually participated in lynchings. I mentioned Willie James Howard. This is the grave of the man who lynched him, Philip Goff. Mr. Goff was a... Oh, that's Moore, I'm sorry. Thank you, dear. That's Harry T. Moore's grave. I've been there twice. He and his wife are buried in Mims, close to where they were killed. A movie was made about his life, and again, as I said earlier, he was the most incredibly brave man that I researched in all of my work. That's Walter Irvin's grave. Walter Irvin was one of the so-called Groveland Four, who were accused of raping a white woman in 1949. And ended up being tried for murder, a very famous case. Eventually, he was let out of prison. Governor Collins commuted his sentence about 14 years after he was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. And then Claude Kirk eventually let him out of prison altogether. But Walter Irvin was one of the people who was a victim in the Groveland incident. Next one. That's Mr. Goff's grave. He deserves a moment. As I mentioned, Goff was a member of the Florida legislature. His daughter was the one who received the letter from Willie James Howard. Mr. Goff got 2 of his friends, and they went to Howard's house. The boy was hiding behind his mother's aprons, literally. These men drive up in a car and take him to the Swanee River and force him to jump in the river, and he was drowned. I went to Goff's grave in the Live Oak City Cemetery. We also have the grave of the other 2 men. Let's go to those, please. who were involved in that killing. McCullers. His nephew is now the city clerk for the city of Live Oak. Nice man. I met him 3 or 4 times. He told me what little he knew about what had happened. Just a very, very nice person. But he never knew what happened with the Willie James Howard killing. No one ever told him. His uncle, who was a part of it, never told him. The next one, please. That's Polly Wilkerson's grave. Polly Wilkerson was one of the white men who was killed at Rosewood. He was kind of a quasi-constable, and he was one of the men who, in 1923, when the Rosewood massacre took place, Polly Wilkerson was one of the 2 men, white men, who walked up onto the home of the porch of the Carrier home, where these people were trying to save their lives, and he was shot dead by Sylvester Carrier, one of the 2 white men who died in that event. I went to his grave in 1998, and typically in that part of the state, the graves are covered with oyster shells, because they're close to the bay, and that's how that's how they cover graves. So his grave was completely, totally exposed and marked clearly in 1997, 1998 when I went. But in recent years, the family has hidden the grave. Since the Rosewood movie came out, they have made this grave impossible to find. The thing about going to graveyards, I have trouble passing a graveyard, is there's a sense that there is unrequited justice in these places, that people have died and their stories haven't been told, and there's a cry to have these things known to the public. What I found in my, I also spent a lot of time with old people. That's Mamie Perry. That's Willie James Howard's aunt. She said that when they lynched her nephew, her sister and her husband came straight to her house in Orlando for refuge, stayed with her for a few days, and then settled in Orlando. When this picture was taken, she was 99 years old. She sat and she gave me a total afternoon of her time. She remembered the flu epidemic of 1918. She was a little girl. She just went on and on about, oh, those people got killed. 99 years old. When I asked Mrs. Perry, what do you do in your spare time? She said, oh, I go over to the old folks' home and help out. She was just complaining. She said, y'all man don't come tomorrow, I'm going to cut this grass myself. Mamie Perry, she's probably dead by now, but she gave him a lot of it. She was, if there was anybody in Willie James' case who should have been given some sort of retribution, some sort of compensation, it would have been her, but she's dead by now. I also want to just mention, that's the school teacher who taught at Willie James Howard School. Now, she was in her late 80s when I met her. Willie James was killed in 1944. She remembered him as a student. There are no photographs of Willie James Howard that survive, but she told me that he was a lovely boy, smart, always singing, whistling, very good with the girls, which is probably what got him killed. Her daughter is watching very unapprovingly at this interview. She didn't like me talking to her mom at all. The next one, please. Oh, that's Willie Evans. He's an interesting man. He's dead now. Willie Evans was 13 years old when Rosewood happened, and he was one of the children in the Carrier house when the attack took place. So he remembered very clearly what happened that night in Rosewood. When the whole thing ended, a lot of the blacks in Rosewood moved to a place called La Coochie, near Tampa. And that's in a nursing home. That's where this photograph was taken of him. He died just a few weeks after this photograph was taken. But his daughter allowed me to talk to him. He couldn't really say very much. But I asked him, so do you remember Sylvester Carrier, the main person who resisted white people that during that riot? Oh, yes. He nodded his head. And I asked him about whether Carrier could play the piano. He got very animated. Oh, yes, he could play the piano. But he was one of 3 survivors that I got a chance to spend some time with, Willie Evans. Also, I met some good white people. I met some crackers. I just want to say something about crackers. All crackers are not bad. So I bought this property in Rosewood, 5 acres vacant land. No one talked to me before I bought this property. I would roll up into somebody's yard, all white, all the black people are gone. There are no black people in Rosewood today. No one would talk to me. I said, where's the black cemetery? Nobody knew. Where was the Baptist church? No one knew anything. So I was out on my property one Saturday, and this guy drives up in a pickup truck with a gun rack in the back, and he stops and yells, "What you doing out here?" I said, "Well, this is my property." He said, "You own this property?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, come over to the house on Saturday. We're going to have some guys over. We're going to have a nice party. Stop by, meet the family." And that's what I did. That's when this photograph was taken. These other 2 guys came in. We're at 10 o'clock in the morning. We're all totally gone. But you know what they said to me? We are misunderstood. Crackers are misunderstood. We are misunderstood. He said, "We don't hate black people." He said, "Do you like Jesus Christ? You like Jesus Christ, don't you?" I said, "Hey, man, me and Jesus tight. If you like Jesus Christ, you're okay with us." And that was basically the attitude that a lot of these guys took, that whites in Rosewood did not get credit for helping blacks, and some white people did do that. In fact, most of the places I went to and studied these events, there were always a few white people who did the right thing, who tried to protect blacks or tried to ward off danger, but they've not gotten proper credit historically. I've tried to correct that in some of these stories. Let's go on to the next one. Okay. I want to talk about some of the ugly truths in Florida history and why Florida black history has been so hidden. The reason that you don't hear a lot about Florida black history is because a lot of it is ugly, painful, unpleasant. One of the most unpleasant truths is that white wealth, that's the Goodwood plantation near Tallahassee, one of the surviving plantations in Florida. White wealth was built on black bodies. Black people worked as slaves and after that as common laborers to build white fortunes. And when you look at the brutality of what had to happen to make these fortunes, there's no wonder that they want to hide it. Let's see the next one. I think this is Charles Plantation, also near Tallahassee. That was burned down now. That was called Vendura, one of the great plantations in Florida, also near Tallahassee. But when you see, there's another big house. I'm not sure where that one is. But when you look at this kind of wealth and you wonder, how do these people come to acquire that much land, that much money, that much social standing on the backs of slaves, on the backs of black people following slavery who worked primarily as slaves by another definition? This is what happened with the result of the agreement between Sherman and Stanton to give blacks land, and then that decision being overturned, and blacks being returned to the fields just as they had been before slavery. This photograph was taken probably in the 1930s near Belle Glade. Belle Glade. The black folks who you see in this photograph are not all that different from the black folks who would have been doing that 100 years earlier. Again, because of this definition of blacks as laborers, domestics, and basically that's it. Blacks did not join labor unions until well into the 1940s and 1950s even. Another ugly truth has to do with voting. If you're a black person in Florida, you could not vote. Except for a brief period during Reconstruction, blacks could vote. But basically, you couldn't vote. Gadsden County, for example, has more black registered voters today than white. They had more slaves than white people back in the 1840s and 1850s, more blacks than whites in Gadsden County, a couple other counties as well. So if blacks had political power, particularly following the Civil War, they could have run these states and did run them during Reconstruction. But as soon as the Union troops were pulled out in 1877, this is what happened. This is what happened in terms of suppressing the black vote very, very effectively. Let me just mention one other thing about Gadsden County before we leave this business about voting. In the race for the White House when Al Gore was running, if about 500 more black people in Gadsden County had voted, Gore would have been president. He would have carried Florida. If Clinton is not working Gadsden County, Jackson County right now, She should be. Another ugly truth was Jim Crow. I saw that sign when I went to the Volusia County Courthouse as a boy. The colored restrooms were around the back in the basement. Then I saw that too. The white water fountains always had with chilled water. And the black water fountains, one, they weren't cleaned. You have a dirty colored water fountain right next to a nice cleaned up white water fountain. This one says ice water white only. And also came up when black people had arrived on the back of the bus. And you dare not move up front. Even if there were seats up front that were empty, you had to stand in the back. And if a white person got on, my mother was on a bus once in Volusia. She's going from DeLand to Sanford. It's been like 1946, 1947. And we're on this bus that Saturday night, sitting on the back, and these white people got on. And we had to get up and give them our seats and stand the rest all the way from Orange City to Sanford. But of all the damages that were done by Jim Crow, this was the worst. Schools. This is Holmes Elementary in Miami, probably taken around 1951, 1952. And when I came to Miami, we had to go to a school like this. We went to Liberty City Elementary School, bus from Opelika all the way down to Liberty City, and then back up in the afternoon, past white schools. And this was 1955, 56, well after the landmark 1954 decision was made by the Supreme Court. Let's go forward, the next one. I just want to, for a moment, relate a story about riding on the buses. I got accepted to college when I was 16 years old. I didn't have to go to the 12th grade. I got to go to college straight from 11th grade on a scholarship. And I'd never been away from home alone. And my mom and my dad and my grandmother took me down to the Graham bus station downtown Miami. This was 1957. Put me on the back of a Greyhound bus, gave me a little bag of food to eat, and told me to stay on the bus until we got to Atlanta the next day. I had a problem with that. I was 16 years old, had not been away from home, but I didn't want to sit on the back of that bus. So the bus got to Fort Lauderdale. I got up and moved up to the middle of the bus. And I rode there all night until the next morning when the bus was in Georgia, across the state line in Georgia, Waycross. And these white girls got on, the white children who were school kids, were using the bus to get to school, the Greyhound bus to get to school. And all these white kids got on the bus, they were talking and laughing, and then one of the white girls sat down next to me. And you could hear a pin drop on that bus. By that time, there were white people sitting behind me. No one said a word when this child sat down next to me. I had never been that close to a white person in my life. And finally somebody said, "Nigga, get up. You know you don't belong up there. Get up and move back where you belong." And other people started chiming in with that. And a Marine, a white young man, a corporal, stood up in uniform and said, "Why are y'all picking on him? He's not bothering anybody." And as soon as he spoke up in my defense, they turned on him. "You must be from the North. You must be a nigger lover. You don't know how we do things down here." It was on one of those scenic cruises that Greyhound used to have, those nice buses. This bus driver pulled that bus along the side of the road. We're outside of Waycross now. Came back to where I was sitting and said, "You are creating a disturbance on this bus. I'm putting you off." And that man put me off that bus. I had to wait till the next bus to Atlanta came about 3 or 4 hours later, and that's how I got to college. Now, mind you, my mom and my grandmother were very nice about telling me about staying on the back of the bus. "Honey, don't you move now. We're going to pray for you. Just stay where you are." My dad, who by that time was a longshoreman, got on after my grandmother and my mom got off. And his message was a little bit different. "Little nigga, don't you move until you ask us to Atlanta tomorrow. Stay right where I put you, goddammit. You got that, nigga, little nigga?" That's the way he talked to us. So when all this happened, I got back home for Christmas break. I didn't tell my parents about having moved. When the new bus, the bus that picked me up after I got put off this bus came by, and I boarded it, where do you think I sat? Back seat. Back seat. You know, one of the other things I found very, very interesting in doing this research is how blacks were the subject of vicious humor, vicious racist humor. This is an example. Call it dining room. It's a toilet. Let's do another one. Something about alligators. There are a number of postcards going back to the early 1900s coming out of Florida, sent north to attract people to come in as tourists, and they have the same theme, a black child being taken by an alligator. It's not so funny when you realize what happened at Disney World a month or so ago. This is another one. I have about, 150 of these and could have a lot more. But blacks were the subject of jokes going all the way back to slavery. The next one. The only hero we had when I was a boy was Joe Louis. That was something that we all looked up to, his fights, his confrontations. But other than Joe Louis in the 1940s, late 30s, there were no black heroes that we could identify with. That's the little church in DeLand that I attended as a boy, St. Anna's Primitive Baptist Church. I put that picture there because I wanted to make the point that when we went to church in the 1940s and 50s, there was a picture of Christ in the back of the church. I'll never forget it. He had long flowing brown hair and blue eyes. He was a white man. We didn't even question that. How could somebody who was born and raised where he was born and raised be blue-eyed? But I never went into a black church during that time, and Christ did not look that way. Again, all the part of indoctrinating people to view the world in a certain way that's not necessarily favorable to them. I want to talk a little bit about slavery. That's the picture of slavery that Southern whites portrayed. Peaceful, calm slaves, sitting around the cabins, having a nice time. Let's look at the next one, which is even more indicative. That picture could have been in the history book that I saw when I was in school. How inaccurate, how untrue. The real story of how slaves were treated might best be represented by this. Slaves were not lynched generally. It cost money to lynch a slave. If you lynched a slave, you didn't get any money back for that body. So most slaves were punished by being whipped, male and female. If a slave was killed, then the slave owner could get reimbursed by the state for the loss of his property. That's a whip. I have several photographs of different kinds of whips that were used to keep slaves in order and in line. And to be honest, there was kind of a mixed bag of how plantation owners treated slaves. Some were decent owners, some were horrible, most were somewhere in between. The point is that people were enslaved and could not leave and had to work for someone else's benefit. Slavery was very popular and was very widespread in North Florida, not so much down here in South Florida. That's a rice plantation. A lot of slaves worked rice in Florida, particularly along the coast areas. But mainly it was cotton that built the fortunes that ended up being so important to white wealth in the South and even in Florida. These are slave cabins. I think these happen to be in Louisiana, but we have photographs of slave cabins all over the state of Florida as well. I want to particularly make the point about labor and about what happened after the Civil War, and this being the result of the abandonment of black hope for land ownership and the requirement that blacks only work as servants and as common laborers. Next. Okay. Should be lynching. Okay. Let me begin by defining a lynching. There's a lot of confusion about what a lynching is. What is the difference between a lynching and a murder? In order for a killing to be considered a lynching, there are three things that you have to have. One is a dead body. Two is it must have happened outside of the law. And three, it must be done for racial or revenge reasons. That makes it a lynching. In Florida, we don't know how many lynchings there were. But one of the misimpressions about lynching is that you need a rope to lynch somebody. Most people who were lynched were not lynched with a rope. They were shot. Most people who were lynched in Florida were not lynched with a rope because people who lynched them didn't know how to tie a hangman's knot. You can't just lynch a person with a rope. It's not that simple. You know how they lynch a lot of people in Florida? These people who didn't know how to tie a hangman's knot? They would get a sapling tree about as tall as this ceiling, and some men would bend the tree over, and they would tie a rope to the top of the tree, and the other end of the rope to a man's neck. Then all of a sudden, they would let go of the tree, and it would break the person's neck. Clean kill. And you didn't need to know how to tie a hangman's knot to accomplish it. That's Reuben Stacy. He was lynched in Fort Lauderdale in 1935 on what's now Los Olas Boulevard. And the deputy sheriff participated in the lynching. He was accused of attacking a white woman. It didn't happen, but he was accused of it anyway. Taken out by this mob of white people in the police officer's car. And years after this happened, a white woman came forward and testified that she saw this man, this victim, in the car with the deputy sheriff on the way to the lynching where he was killed. The sheriff made the people who didn't have a gun use his gun to fire into the body. The view was, if you're here and you want to participate in a lynching, you got to fire a bullet into the body so that you can't claim that you didn't help to kill this person. Before we leave this, it was not uncommon to see this. Children at lynchings. Babies at lynchings. Next. That's Newberry. That's a very interesting. This is Newberry. 6 of the victims who were lynched in Lynch Hammock in 1916. I wanted to know who these men were. I found this photograph in the bowels of the Duval County Public Library about 20 years ago. I had no idea where it was taken, who these people were. Finally, I met a lady, a cracker woman, in Alachua County who was from this area, and I showed her this photograph, and she recognized most of these people. She said, "That was in Newberry. I know I know these people. These are the Dudley brothers. These are the men who were one of the most prominent families in Newberry was these four guys up front." Now, the Dudley farm that these guys, their family owned, is now a state park. It is a recreation of cracker life. The Dudley family farm is a Florida State Park. You can go to it and visit it. Beautiful recreation of cracker life. So I go to this park. I wanted to know who these guys were since the Dudleys own this land where the park is. And I went in and I covered the bottom of the photograph so you couldn't see the bodies. And a park ranger come and ask, "Do you know who these guys are?" "Oh yeah, that's the Ralph. Named all these. That's a banker. That's a politician. This guy's an elected official." And then I showed him the bodies. Uncovered the bottom of the photograph and showed him the bodies. Oh my God. Stella Young is right here. You can't see her. They tried to hide the woman who was lynched that day. They tried to hide her under the bodies of these male victims. Next image. Next session, okay. I made a point of having very few lynching photographs in this presentation. There's no reason to overmake the point. Now, I want to talk about sex from, no, it's not Trump, no. The psychologist in me wanted to understand how is it that law-abiding white men who under normal circumstances go to church, respect the law. How could white men on a Saturday night cut off a man's testicles, put him in a jar with his fingers and his toes in other jars, and pass that around, and then go to church Sunday morning with a clear conscience? How could this happen? How could, what, as my mother, what would possess them to be able to do that with a clear conscience? Goes back to sex. This is not an easy part of this discussion to have, but the problem with race and sex and lynching and violence, a lot of it goes back to the slave trading bloc when slaves were brought into this country. The most able, the strongest, the smartest of those who were loaded upon, on slave ships and brought across survived. Many others died. So when slaves were auctioned off, you had healthy, relatively speaking, healthy men and women brought to the block. Normally they would feed them extra to fatten them up a little bit, like you do a hog or a cow you're going to sell. Put grease on their bodies, shine them up a little bit. Sometimes they give them a coin so they would feel like they had something. And then put these men and women on the block where dozens, if not hundreds, of white people could look at them. Black men made their lives survive by using their bodies. They were not shopkeepers. They worked with their bodies. They were healthy, for the most part, strong men around white women all the time, in close contact with white women. Next slide. The myth that evolved was that white women would not and did not wish to have sex with black men. The image that was portrayed in the South was that a white woman would rather die than have sex with a black man. Well, what I've learned is that a whole lot of white women fell on that sword, metaphorically speaking. There was more sex between black men and white women, white girls and black boys that has ever been recognized in Southern history. The view is that these women were so pure, so sacred, that they would rather die than have sex with a black man. And so this was the one sin that would surely get you killed faster than anything except killing a white law enforcement officer. So they put white women on this pedestal. It was a pedestal too high because a lot of blacks and whites lived right together in the South. It wasn't like it is today with ghettos where black folks lived here, white folks lived. They all lived together in the country. And kids do what kids do. So a lot of the attempt to maintain control over black males in particular had to do with trying to keep them away from white girls, white women. Next slide, please. Now, if you believe what Southern lore would have you believe, you would be of the view that there was very limited sex contact between white women and black men, and that white women who did do this were somehow or another fallen women who were then banned from the community, usually sent someplace else. What you would not know is that some of these relationships were enduring relationships. Some of them lasted over quite a period of time. There were even occasions in Florida where a black man or white woman were allowed to live together if they didn't flaunt it too much. The taboo nature of the way sex was treated in the South led to a lot of the violence that I wanted to speak to for just a moment. This has to do with this. You can go to the next image, please. Okay. I wanted to know about sexual mutilations and how it was that there were no white men who were sexually mutilated when they were lynched. So I'll read this passage for you. A few victims of lynching in Florida were white men who had outraged their communities who had so outraged their communities that their fellow whites felt compelled to dispatch them to the next world without the benefit of legal trial. White men were lynched for many reasons, including allegations of murder, sexual assault, cattle rustling, and other offenses. However, mutilations, in particular sexual mutilations, were unheard of in instances of white men being lynched. This was the treatment reserved for black men and boys, and it reflected a sexual obsession that was deeply embedded in Southern society and which may not yet have been entirely expunged. Believing their own myth about black male sexuality, some white men did horrible things to black male victims, including cutting off body parts of lynching victims and preserving them in chemicals for laughs, or distributing them to family members of women who were allegedly attacked. Although it was commonly done to blacks, I am not aware of a single instance in the lynching history of Florida after which the penis of a lynched white man was preserved in formaldehyde and circulated in the community. I also want to say something about the way in which sex was used by white masters for financial benefit beyond just having people work. I read so many stories about slave families, moms and dads, who prayed for ugly daughters. The last thing you wanted was a pretty daughter, because they were normally taken by about age 12 or 13. I think the last image we have of not the master's daughter, the little girl. It was up? Oh, okay, all right. I have a photograph, we don't have it, of a girl who looks white, blonde hair, about 11 or 12 years old. She wrote a book, or a book was written about her, called The Master's Daughter. The reason why mulatto children were so valuable was that they would be sold as house servants and concubines, sexual objects for white men. So they were bred for this purpose, not just to work in the fields. So as I said, a lot of black parents wanted their daughters to be marked unattractive so that they might not be taken. I want to just close my comments with I'm going to read the last paragraph in the book, and then we'll take some questions and reactions from you folks. So 1 second. There is healing yet to be done. There are stories yet to be told, both tragic and triumphant. African Americans must realize, however, that forgiveness works. True, some of the descendants of the people who did those bad things still live in Florida. But what guilt should the current generation of whites bear for the sins of their relatives? I say none. On the other hand, whites in Florida and elsewhere in the country should stop living in denial. Terrible things did happen to blacks in this country, and the debt to African Americans is not yet fully paid. Let us all face our history together, even the bad parts. Let us learn from our mistakes of the past and move on. After all, the challenge our country and the world face today leaves no room for racial, ethnic, or religious divisions. That's the end of the book. You can turn the lights up and take questions. Yes, questions?
Folks, if you have a comment or a question, please raise your hand and let me get to you with the microphone, or else the live stream audience watching at home will not be able to hear what we have to say. So, who you guys were first over here?
Thank you. Yeah, I've read that there was a tremendous difference between slavery under the Spanish and French and slavery under the States, other than the fact that they banished it much sooner.
Yes.
Can you just briefly touch on that?
Sure. Slaves in Spanish Florida could own property. They had legal rights. They could marry a free person. They could sue to be separated from a cruel master. They could buy their way out of slavery. So even though slavery existed in places in Florida like St. Augustine, Tampa, some other places, it was relatively more benign than American slavery. One big difference was that the Catholic Church was came between slavery and slave masters to dictate certain treatments that the church required that slaves be afforded. So yes, that was the difference. Still, it was slavery.
Ma'am, you had a question.
How difficult was it to find records? I mean, was most of the history you unearthed from interviewing people? Were there records? I mean, how much
Yes.
has this been buried not to be found?
It's amazing how much information is available. I read a lot of old newspapers, and there are some very good ones in Florida that actually have a pretty good record, although sometimes distorted about what happened. For example, the Florida Times-Union, the great paper to go to, the Gainesville Sun, a very old paper. The Miami Herald, not so much. As a matter of fact, I was going to read a passage. Hold on a second so I can find this. Just a second. Hold on a second. I can't find it now. I was going to read a passage from the Miami Herald, but one of the things about newspapers and using newspapers in this kind of research is that they were usually all white folks were innocent, all black folks were guilty. And the newspapers played that from the beginning. When the Groveland Four happened, these 4 black men were accused of raping this white woman. The Orlando Sentinel published a cartoon on its editorial page. The men hadn't even been tried yet, with 4 electric chairs. So newspapers they were a very good source, but you have to weigh them very carefully. Seth, yeah.
Doctor, a question and a comment. Did you talk about the fact that in Florida there were either more lynchings or more lynchings per capita than in any other state in the country?
That's true. There were more lynchings in Florida per capita than in Mississippi, than in Alabama. It's amazing. You wonder why that happened. Part of the reason for that was that Florida was settled late, and it was a wilderness, and there was no law in Florida for a long time. So whites who moved into Florida, most of them Scotch-Irish people, tended to take the law into their own hands. So they lynched white and black people. They lynched a lot more black people than white people. But yes, Florida has a much higher lynching rate than any other state in the South.
Right. And a quick comment. I don't know if you covered it or not, but the great Al Daniels, the chairman of Burdines, in 1960 ordered the desegregation of the Miami and Miami Beach stores 4 years before the Civil Rights Act. The other thing I want to mention is that wonderful sign, and I don't want anybody to say, oh no, he's denying the sign. We have the colored sign from the FEC station in downtown Miami. We have the signs, but the sign you showed is on eBay what you call a fantasy item. There were no signs that ever had the name or the initials of the railroad or a date. So I want you to, and there were no cardboard signs, they were wood. Right. So I just want you to understand that the signs were rampant, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes.
But that sign is a fantasy sign.
Thank you, Seth. Yes.
Would you repeat the definition of lynching?
Yes. It must be outside of law. There has to be a dead body. There was a contention about that part. The motive for it must be revenge or race, right? And then so a caveat was thrown in that it must be done by 2 or more people, but that's debatable. But those other factors are determinants. Yes?
Just a comment with a question. As late as 1963, 64, and 65, I had a black partner, and we traveled through Central and North Florida, and the difficulties were extensive. A place to eat was hard to find, and we generally ate in the car. And a place to sleep for both of us was impossible, unless we found somebody's home. Would you address your comments to the later part of segregation, even though it might have been unlawful, it still existed?
Oh, well, segregation in higher education existed into the late 60s. Despite Brown versus Board of Education. When I wanted to go to graduate school in psychology, I applied to enter the PhD program in psychology at the University of Florida, Gainesville. I was in the Navy. I was in uniform. I was aboard ship. And I sent this letter to apply to enter the University of Florida, Gainesville. I wanted to get my doctorate from my own state university. And about a month or two later, a letter arrived on board. Dear Lieutenant Dunn, I still have the letter somewhere. The University of Florida does not accept Negro students in its graduate programs. However, the state of Florida will pay your tuition at any university that you get admitted to outside of the state of Florida. Yeah. That was how they made it for Plessy versus Ferguson. They can't just say you can't go to, we don't have a school for you. They had to offer you something that was considered equal to what was not available to you. So they offered to pay my tuition at wherever I went. I applied to the University of Tennessee, and Tennessee gave me a full ride, no questions. So today when Tennessee plays Florida football, I'm a UT fan. Yes.
That's over here.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. You got to follow the mic. Yes.
Dr. Dunn, as you engaged in the research for your book, what was your most memorable discovery?
Good question. That's a good question. I think, wow. I think the thing that stays with me more than anything else was what happened to Willie James. I cannot get past that lynching. You know, it's a 15-year-old kid buried in an unmarked grave for 50 years. That one really struck home with me. And then Newberry, because they killed so many people at one time, including this woman who was pregnant, and then covered it all up. There are black people in Newberry and Alachua County who won't talk about that today. So the expanse of that, how many lives were affected by that lynching, also stayed with me. And then on the positive side, you had voices of people saying this is wrong and fighting against it and standing up against what was going on. And I found that to be encouraging. So a mixed bag, but mainly the killings that went so unnoticed for so long affected me most deeply.
Incidentally, Dr. Dunn, this is an alumni of your Morehouse.
Oh, really? Morehouse man. I got some Morehouse stories I could share with you. Yeah.
Well, this is another Morehouse man here in support.
All right.
Could you give your insight on why Harry T. Moore, which I consider the first martyr of the civil rights movement, how come he's not as known as some of these other civil rights leaders?
He was too early. That's a very good question. Harry T. Moore was too early. He was dead by the time the civil rights movement took off. The NAACP, and he was the head of the Florida NAACP, treated him very badly. Very, very badly. They were angry with him because he was registering blacks to vote as Democrats. And at that time, most blacks were Republicans. So here you have Harry T. Moore out there registering Democrats because he knew sooner or later blacks were going to be able to join the Democratic Party. So the Republican black leadership in New York in the NAACP had a lot of problems with Harry T. Moore. Those problems with Moore were solved when Moore was killed. Then they embraced him as a fallen hero. But basically, he was treated very badly by the NAACP. And part of his legacy was buried with the NAACP ignoring his contributions. That's a good question, though.
Anyone else have a question or comment? Still have a second. Anyone else? Last question or comment for Dr. Dunn? All right, well, if there are no more questions, then a note to our internet audience watching at home. There's still time for you to call the number on your screen, and we could ship a copy of the book to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. The shipping, not the book. For those of you here in the house, we have the book for sale at the counter in the front room over there. Dr. Dunn's going to be signing at the table to the right of the screen, and this has been a fascinating presentation. Please give a warm hand
Thank you all
to
for coming
Dr.
out.
Marvin Dunn. Thank you very much. Okay.